Everyone in the luxury cafe laughed when an ostentatious bully shoved a quiet stranger straight into an elegant woman sitting alone by the window. Dark coffee spilled in a wide arc across her expensive cream cashmere coat. The bully smirked, expecting security to immediately drag the poor man out. Instead, the blonde woman slowly stood, looked briefly at the embarrassed stranger, then turned toward the bully with an expression of absolute ice. "Do you have any idea whose life you just dismantled?" she asked. Seconds later, every employee and customer in the cafe completely froze. The morning had started without any indication of disruption. At 8:45, the Glass Helix Cafe was a sanctuary of quiet luxury and sharp espresso machines. Arthur Sterling occupied a small table in the corner. He wore a dark charcoal sweater and carried the unhurried posture of a man requiring zero attention. He turned the pages of a vintage engineering text with scarred, capable hands. A mechanical pencil rested behind his ear as his coffee slowly cooled. 12 minutes later, Eleanor Vance walked through the glass doors. She wore a pristine cream coat over navy silk, radiating an effortless, formidable authority. She chose the VIP table by the window, ordered a black Americano, and began reviewing complex structural load data on her digital tablet. They sat 30 feet apart, entirely unaware of one another. The quiet morning proceeded efficiently, holding no warning of the collision about to occur. Eleanor's screen displayed intricate load-bearing matrices, a digital empire requiring absolute and constant control. She possessed the rare, chilling ability to command an entire room without speaking a single word. She had chosen this specific window table because it offered a complete, unobstructed view of the room's subtle hierarchy. It was a predatory instinct she utilized daily in high-stakes corporate boardrooms, sizing up power dynamics effortlessly. 30 feet away, Arthur remained completely absorbed in the analog world of physical engineering and forgotten schematics. His focus was identical to hers, yet applied to the fundamental weight, friction, and tension of heavy materials. The cafe existed as a neutral zone, holding these two massive gravities in a delicate, temporary suspension. The baristas moved with deliberate care, intuitively understanding the unspoken requirement for undisturbed silence around the window table. The morning light shifted slightly, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished dark walnut floors. This perfect symmetry of isolation was about to be irreversibly shattered by the arrival of a loud, unearned entitlement. Carter Hayes stepped through the shattered silence, his heavy footsteps demanding immediate attention from a room that preferred quiet. He was accompanied by two subordinate associates who mirrored his every expression, their careers tethered entirely to his volatile moods. Carter wore an aggressively tailored navy suit, projecting his newly acquired real estate wealth like an offensive weapon. He approached the polished counter, audibly sighing at the artisanal menu as if the elegant establishment was wasting his valuable time. The barista absorbed his loud complaints with practiced, blank professionalism, revealing absolutely nothing of her internal distaste. Even as he ordered, Carter's restless eyes scanned the cafe floor, automatically searching for a social hierarchy to dominate. His gaze passed the window table, briefly registering Eleanor's immaculate cream coat, instinctively recognizing a predator of higher caliber. He quickly averted his eyes, unwilling to challenge actual authority, and continued his search for a more suitable, defenseless target. The scanning stopped abruptly as his attention locked onto the shadowy corner where a quiet man sat in a worn gray sweater. A reflexive smirk formed on Carter's face. The quiet, unmoving presence of Arthur Sterling was exactly the kind of target he required. Carter left the counter, moving toward his chosen table, deliberately altering his path to pass unnecessarily close to Arthur's corner. His two associates followed, their posture shifting in anticipation of the familiar, cruel entertainment about to unfold. The cafe's atmosphere tightened, a collective, silent realization among the patrons that a boundary was about to be crossed. Carter intentionally stopped, standing uncomfortably close to the seated man, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with Arthur's faded clothes. He made a loud, derogatory comment about the cost of the coffee, designed entirely to humiliate the quiet stranger. Arthur did not look up. He simply turned another page of his structural dynamics textbook with slow, methodical precision. This lack of reaction was a profound offense to a man who relied entirely on the fear and deference of others. Carter's smirk hardened into a tight line of genuine irritation. The silence was not fear, it was absolute dismissal. He leaned closer, his voice dropping its theatrical volume, adopting a low, threatening tone meant only for Arthur. Arthur finally lifted his eyes. His gaze possessed the terrifying, perfectly still clarity of extremely deep water. "I would appreciate it if you stepped back," Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of heat or intimidation. Carter let out a short, disbelieving laugh, looking back at his associates to invite them into his escalating contempt. The associates obliged with nervous smiles, sensing that the dynamic had shifted in a way they could not predict. "You take up a table all morning with a $3 coffee," Carter mocked, his volume rising again for the room to hear. Arthur calmly straightened his cup, picked up his mechanical pencil, and prepared to return to his reading. That was the final unforgivable error. A man built on dominance could not survive the architecture of absolute indifference. Whether calculated or the irreversible product of a bad impulse, Carter stepped forward and shoved Arthur's shoulder hard. Off balance from having just shifted his weight, Arthur stumbled sideways with the sudden, inescapable physics of the force. He fell directly into the massive window table, colliding heavily against the dark walnut surface where Eleanor sat. The dark Americano went across her pristine cashmere coat in a terrible arc, and the entire cafe instantly fell into a breathless vacuum. The silence that followed was absolute. Every customer, every barista, suspended mid-motion as the severity of the accident registered. Carter stepped back, a rehearsed smirk already forming. He prepared to watch the powerful executive destroy the helpless man. His associates mirrored his satisfaction, assuming that the hierarchy had been successfully enforced through chaos. Arthur quickly steadied himself against the table, his face reflecting pure, quiet mortification rather than fear. "I am incredibly sorry," Arthur said, reaching instinctively for his wallet to settle the debt of the ruined luxury garment. Eleanor Vance did not move. She looked down at the dark liquid absorbing into her pristine cashmere, her expression unreadable. The cafe manager rushed forward with linen napkins, apologizing frantically on behalf of the establishment. Carter spread his hands theatrically. "Not my fault," he announced to the room. "The guy clearly has no balance." Eleanor finally looked up. Her piercing green eyes bypassed the manager, bypassed Carter completely, and locked onto Arthur. "Are you hurt?" she asked quietly. Three simple words that instantly shattered every expectation the room had assembled. The cafe fell into a silence deeper than before. It was the silence of a room that had just completely revised its expectations. Everyone had anticipated the powerful woman would explode in rage and demand the removal of the shabby man. Instead, Eleanor looked at Arthur with the gaze of someone who had just discovered a priceless artifact from a great distance. "I am fine," Arthur replied, still clutching his worn wallet. "I am truly sorry about your coat." "Please sit down," she said softly, then pivoted her icy, unwavering gaze toward Carter. "And you," her voice cut through the air, "should remain absolutely silent." Carter's smirk froze. The weight of her command crushed his arrogance in a single second. Eleanor leaned down, picking up Arthur's old engineering book that had fallen beneath the table during the collision. She scanned the scars of mechanical labor on his knuckles, then looked down at the title of the structural engineering text. Do you know much about structural dynamic load systems? She asked, her voice sounding like the beginning of a new era. A little, Arthur replied. The words were chosen with the care of a man who knew that true humility was not self-deprecation, but absolute accuracy. The silence between them was not the silence of the room, it was conversational, exploratory, and heavy with unspoken understanding. From across the room, Carter had regained enough composure to let out a disbelieving scoff. "Lady, I don't know what you think you're doing." "I asked you to remain silent," Eleanor said without turning her head, a skill honed through years of dominating boardroom environments. That invisible pressure forced Carter into absolute silence. Her words landed not as a warning, but as an undeniable, cold reality. The cafe door swung open abruptly. Eleanor's assistant hurried in, slightly breathless, clutching a secure digital tablet tightly. He glanced at Arthur's face, then down at the verification data on his device, his expression shifting to absolute disbelief. "Tell me about your previous work," Eleanor continued, her voice now carrying a sharp, deliberate edge of professional inquiry. Arthur turned the book slightly in his hands, an old habit of a thinking engineer. Load systems, structural optimization, a few old patents. The assistant stepped to Eleanor's side, tilting the tablet toward her and whispering in a voice that trembled slightly, "It's him." Eleanor did not look away. She had spent 3 years searching for the name attached to the patents that saved her company. That name had been licensed to Vance Technology in 2017, and the person who held it had vanished without a trace. Now, that face was sitting across from her, and she understood that rushing the moment would only waste what she had waited for. "The adaptive load balancing system in our infrastructure network runs on your core framework," Eleanor said, her voice clear and measured. "Not a version of it. Not an interpretation of it. It is precisely your framework." Arthur looked at her for a long time. "Those patents were transferred long ago. I did not track what happened to them." "I know," she replied. "In 2018, when our main architecture risked collapse, your system was the reason we did not lose everything." Across the room, Carter had gone completely still. His theatrical confidence had been drained from him without him realizing it. His associates sensed the danger. The most cowardly of them had already retreated, slowly edging toward the door before things worsened. Even the cafe manager, who had intended to remove Arthur, stood frozen with a stack of napkins, forcing himself to re-evaluate his worldview. Eleanor stood, the dark stain on her cream coat failing to diminish the overwhelming weight of her professional authority. She turned, her gaze cutting across the room to the man in the navy suit who was now visibly trembling. "I do not recall giving you permission to leave," Eleanor stated, her voice slicing through the thick, uncomfortable tension of the room. Carter froze, his shoulders slumping. He realized that the high-stakes contracts he had fought so hard to secure were now evaporated. A major investor, who had been silently observing the conflict from the opposite table, stood and adjusted his blazer buttons. He walked toward the center of the room, his eyes filled with absolute disdain for Carter before turning toward Arthur. "We will have to revisit the terms of our partnership today," the investor said, his voice carrying the cold gravity of a man who controlled capital. "Anyone who does not recognize the value of Marcus Hale's work is not worth our time," he added firmly. Carter stammered, attempting to offer a meaningless explanation, but the room had already moved past the sound of his voice. Arthur still sat quietly in the corner, holding his cold coffee with both hands. His absolute stillness was the heaviest penalty Carter would ever face. Carter had no words left to defend himself. He scanned the room, meeting only cold, judgmental stares, then retreated toward the door. His shoulders slumped, the facade of his daily arrogance crumbling into the hollow reality of a failed man. He pushed through the heavy glass door, stepping out into the bustling street, unnoticed and entirely insignificant. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive tension vanished, replaced by a sudden, respectful curiosity toward the corner table. Eleanor walked toward Arthur.
It's a pleasure to finally
She no
meet you.
longer looked at
I'm
him
looking
as a
forward to this new
stranger,
chapter.
but as a
Do
partner
I?
who had just been
Welcome.
recovered.
To
I know
realize
you
this
walked
vision,
away from
we
your
need
patents,
precision.
but the industry
Your
still needs
technical
your
expertise
precision,
is
she said with
unmatched,
genuine
and frankly,
professional
essential
respect.
to this project.
Arthur placed his
I
cup
appreciate
down.
you laying that out.
He looked at her,
It
his
certainly
posture
changes
losing
how
its
I view the
defensive
proposal.
edge, appearing more open to the possibility. Frederick Oakes, the investor,
Very well.
stepped closer,
We accept
awaiting
the
a
terms
signal
you
of
laid out.
intent from the man who had saved the company.
The
I will
merger
consider
happen.
it, Arthur responded.
I have ensured
A
that
short,
everyone
quiet
involved
reply,
will find
yet for the
this
powerful people watching, it was exactly what they required. They
I'm
stood
glad we
together,
decided to meet
the
here.
urban noise
Feels
returning,
perfect, doesn't it?
initiating a
It really
new
does.
dialogue where the order
I
of
think this is
respect
the
had
beginning
finally
of a
been
beautiful
restored.
story.
The
current
urban
proposal
noise
simply
outside
won't
the glass
suffice.
walls seemed
We
to
need to
dim,
reconsider the
creating
terms
an
before the London
isolated bubble
Exchange
of
opens,
professional
or we
clarity
risk
at the window
losing
table.
everything.
Eleanor opened her tablet,
As you can
displaying the
see,
complex
projected
blueprints for the
energy
new
flow through
municipal
the new
grid
central
project that had been
nexus is
stalled for
optimized
months.
for peak hours.
Arthur leaned forward, his focus shifting from the past to the immense technical challenges currently facing the company. He pointed to a structural bottleneck in the design, his scarred fingers moving with the precision of a master craftsman. Eleanor watched him, captivated not just by his technical brilliance, but by the calm, unassuming way he solved massive problems. Frederick Oakes sat nearby, silently taking notes, realizing that the value of this meeting far exceeded his initial expectations. The barista approached with a fresh pot of coffee, her movements fluid and respectful, no longer needing to hide her interest. Other patrons glanced toward them, their earlier judgment replaced by the unmistakable air of witnesses to something significant. Arthur proposed a radical redesign of the load-balancing architecture, his voice steady, grounded in decades of deep experience. Eleanor's eyes brightened, she knew immediately that the company's future had just been fundamentally secured by this quiet man. Arthur's voice remained steady, dissecting the structural flaws in the municipal grid design with surgical, terrifying precision. Eleanor's pen hovered over her notebook, her usual composure replaced by the genuine thrill of a student discovering new truths. Frederick Oakes leaned in, his professional distance forgotten, completely absorbed by the logic of Arthur's proposed architecture. The redundancy systems are misaligned, Arthur observed, tracing a line on the tablet screen with his calloused finger. He explained the flow of data traffic as if it were a living organism that needed to be balanced, not just controlled. The cafe around them seemed to fade into a blur of gray, leaving only the focused, high-intensity clarity of their dialogue. For the first time in years, Arthur felt the spark of a problem that was actually worth the weight of his attention. Eleanor watched the map on the tablet shift under his guidance, realizing that his insights were far beyond current industry standards. This configuration, Arthur murmured, could prevent system failures under peak stress that your current engineers haven't even anticipated. Eleanor nodded, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She understood now that her company's entire future had just been fundamentally secured by this quiet man. Arthur's hands moved with fluid, expert confidence across the digital interface, remapping nodes that had been paralyzed by inefficient design. Eleanor watched the screen, her breath catching as the system's projected stability rose sharply under Arthur's new configuration. She had spent months consulting with high-paid experts who offered only patches. Arthur offered a fundamental, elegant restructuring. Frederick Oakes leaned in, his professional distance forgotten, completely absorbed by the logic of Arthur's proposed architecture. The bottleneck isn't the load itself, Arthur explained, his voice low and steady, it is the timing of the distribution sequence. He adjusted a primary relay parameter, and the visual representation of the grid on the tablet turned from angry red to a calm, efficient blue. Eleanor realized that every hour she had spent doubting her company's future had been a result of not knowing this man. The cafe around them seemed to vibrate with the sheer gravity of what was happening at that small, scratched window table. A barista, watching from the counter, instinctively lowered the music volume, intuitively preserving the silence required for this technical rebirth. Eleanor met Arthur's gaze, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. The debt of the accident had just been paid in full by pure brilliance. The simulation on the tablet finalized, the grid now glowing with a cool, stable blue that signaled absolute peak efficiency. Eleanor stared at the screen, her gaze shifting between the digital perfection and the quiet man who had orchestrated it. Frederick Oak stood up, his eyes bright with the realization that he was witnessing a rare, once-in-a-generation mind at work. "The parameters are sound," Arthur said, pushing the tablet back toward Eleanor with a subtle, respectful gesture. Eleanor took the device, her fingers lingering on the screen, feeling the weight of the company's future now resting in her hands. "We cannot let this expertise remain confined to a corner table," Eleanor stated, her voice full of newfound, resolute purpose. The air in the cafe felt charged, as if the very walls recognized the significance of the partnership being forged. Other staff members looked on, their earlier judgment replaced by the unmistakable air of witnesses to something significant. Arthur proposed a radical redesign of the load-balancing architecture, his voice steady, grounded in decades of deep experience. Eleanor's eyes brightened. She knew immediately that the company's future had just been fundamentally secured by this quiet man. The atmosphere at the window table remained electric, the initial shock of the morning giving way to the frantic pace of potential. Eleanor's senior engineers had been observing the interaction from the nearby workstations, their faces tight with unvoiced apprehension. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, a mixture of professional insecurity and the fear of a looming, radical restructuring. "He's just an outsider," one engineer muttered, unable to hide the sharp edge of jealousy in his tone. They watched Arthur, a man in an old sweater, easily dismantle architectural problems that had haunted them for months. It was a painful mirror for them, as Arthur's effortless technical clarity highlighted the limitations of their own expertise. Eleanor noticed the restless energy of her team, but her focus remained anchored to the structural solutions Arthur was detailing. Frederick Oakes observed the tension, his smile thinning as he noted the resentment brewing among the company's internal ranks. Arthur, completely oblivious to the office politics brewing, continued to map out the grid's future with unwavering, humble intensity. A quiet battle line was being drawn within the firm, between those clinging to their established order and the genius who threatened to rewrite it. Marcus, the lead engineer, walked toward the window table, his jaw set with the rigid posture of a man defending his territory. The air around the table turned noticeably cold as he arrived, uninvited, into the middle of their technical discussion. "This approach seems highly theoretical," Marcus said, his voice dripping with thin, professional veneer designed to mask his resentment. He glanced at Arthur with a dismissive smirk, clearly expecting the quiet man to stumble under the weight of a public challenge. Arthur did not look defensive, he merely paused, his eyes calm as he assessed the underlying motive of the intrusion. Eleanor's expression tightened instantly, her protective instinct toward Arthur and his work flaring up with quiet, controlled anger. "The data proves the theory," Arthur replied, his voice neutral, presenting a single, indisputable figure from the tablet screen. Marcus looked at the number, his face momentarily flickering with confusion as he realized he lacked the context to refute it. The senior engineer's attempt to assert dominance backfired, leaving him exposed and intellectually outmatched in front of his peers. A silence descended upon the workstations, the power dynamic in the room had shifted, definitively and irreversibly, against the old guard. The silence that lingered after the failed challenge was stifling. Marcus stood paralyzed, his reputation as the lead engineer visibly fracturing. Eleanor did not offer him a lifeline. She turned away from the confrontation, signaling the end of the old hierarchy. "We are implementing Sterling's architecture immediately," she announced, her voice echoing through the now deferential quiet of the office floor. A murmur of shock rippled through the staff. The change was no longer theoretical, it was an immediate, structural reality. Younger engineers began to look at Arthur not with jealousy, but with a sudden, hungry interest in his methods. Marcus retreated to his workstation, his hands trembling as he stared at a screen that had suddenly become foreign to him. Frederick Oakes nodded in silent approval, his confidence in the project now anchored to Arthur's quiet, devastating expertise. Arthur returned to his notes, his demeanor remaining as humble and unassuming as when he first arrived at the cafe. Eleanor stepped into his personal space, her tone shifting from corporate authority to private, earnest professional partnership. She understood that the transition was complete, the era of mediocrity had ended, and the era of Arthur Sterling had begun. The office floor felt like a kingdom in the midst of a silent, bloodless coup. The old hierarchy was dissolving in real time. Eleanor moved through the desks, her presence authoritative and final, as she began the process of reassigning the project leads. The senior engineers, once secure in their positions, now watched with mounting dread as their authority was systematically dismantled. Team Alpha will shift to the secondary legacy support, Eleanor announced, her voice leaving no room for negotiation or protest. A heavy, lingering silence followed her words, the sound of long-standing professional security being pulled away from the veterans. Younger engineers began to look at Arthur not with jealousy, but with a sudden, hungry interest in his methods. Arthur remained focused at the window table, his presence acting as the silent fulcrum upon which the entire company pivoted. Marcus gathered his things, his movements stiff and devoid of his former arrogance, his ego finally shattered by the new order. The division within the firm became physical, a wall between the old guard clinging to ghosts and the future-focused team forming around Arthur. Eleanor stood at the head of the floor, observing the shift. The era of mediocrity had officially been purged from her organization. The digital transition accelerated, with Arthur directly embedding his structural logic into the company's central server nodes. A veteran engineer, watching from his terminal, felt his relevance slipping away and felt a surge of cold, calculated malice. He surreptitiously executed a command sequence designed to trigger a cascading error within Arthur's new, fragile sublayers. Alarm lights flickered briefly across the office floor, casting an ominous red hue over the rows of pristine, silent workstations. Arthur didn't panic, he simply observed the data stream on his screen, noting the artificial origin of the sudden anomaly. "There is an unauthorized injection in the sequence," Arthur stated calmly, his voice ringing clearly in the tense office space. Eleanor immediately stood, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk, knowing precisely who would benefit from a system failure. She marched toward the veteran engineer's desk, her pace rapid, her expression hardening into a look of absolute, unforgiving steel. "Identify the source of the glitch, or surrender your credentials immediately," she commanded, the ultimatum hanging heavy in the air. The engineer sat frozen, trapped by his own hubris, as the eyes of his colleagues turned toward him in collective judgment. The air inside the office felt remarkably lighter after Marcus's departure. The tension was replaced by a cold, efficient clarity. Eleanor walked to the head of the floor, her demeanor projecting the quiet resolve of a woman who had finally cleared her path. Effective immediately, Arthur Sterling is appointed as lead system architect, she announced, her voice resonating without a trace of doubt. A ripple of quiet awe spread through the room. The transition of power was absolute, shifting the company's trajectory overnight. Arthur stood by the window, his expression remaining modest, though the weight of his new responsibility was visible in his posture. The younger engineers exchanged looks of exhilaration, they understood that their work was finally being tethered to true genius. Eleanor turned toward Arthur, her gaze no longer strictly professional, but filled with the relief of a leader who had found her match. "We have a decade of structural debt to pay," she said, handing him the master administrative clearance for the entire grid. Arthur accepted the clearance, his scarred fingers brushing the device, acknowledging the return to a life he had once walked away from. The office floor began to hum with a new, productive intensity as the team adjusted to the dawn of a new, structural reality. The conference room overlooking the city was bathed in the cool, blue light of data-driven ambition as they began their review. Eleanor sat with undivided attention, her posture reflecting a complete trust that she had never before extended to a subordinate. Arthur navigated the 5-year infrastructure projections with ease, his voice steady, anchoring the abstract data in concrete reality. He outlined a decentralized load balancing model that would redefine how the entire region handled peak-hour energy distribution. Eleanor nodded, her mind already visualizing the market dominance that Arthur's structural brilliance was about to secure for them. Outside the glass walls, the remaining senior engineers watched the session with a mixture of professional envy and reluctant realization. Reports began to flood in from the field. The minor adjustments Arthur made had already reduced server lag by nearly 40%. Frederick Oakes, watching the real-time analytics, finally allowed himself a smile, knowing his investment was now protected by a genius. The transition was no longer a question of internal politics, it was a matter of objective, measurable success that silenced all dissent. Arthur closed his tablet, his eyes meeting Eleanor's. The unspoken weight of their partnership settled firmly into the quiet room. 6 months later, the Vance Technology Central Hub hummed with a new, orchestrated energy under Arthur's finalized structural design. The regional grid was no longer prone to instability, it functioned with a quiet, efficient rhythm that the industry had never seen. Eleanor sat in her office, watching the live success metrics climb, a look of profound satisfaction settling on her face. Arthur, no longer the man in the corner, moved through the office with the confidence of a leader whose vision was now reality. Younger engineers followed him, eager to absorb even a fraction of the architectural brilliance that had saved their careers. Frederick Oakes sat with Eleanor, finalizing the expansion papers, their faces glowing in the soft light of confirmed success. The past friction with the old guard was merely a footnote, a testament to the necessary purging that had enabled this rebirth. Arthur walked toward the window, looking out over the city he had helped secure, his path finally clear of ghosts. He met Eleanor's eyes from across the room, a silent, mutual understanding affirming that their partnership was only just beginning. The era of mediocrity was gone, the new structural reality of the Vance Empire stood as a monument to precision and trust.